So how did we get this so wrong? If what I'm saying is right, then how is it common sense? How is it conventional wisdom that the welfare state is a great achievement? And so I want to say a few words about this before we wrap up. So the first reason, I think, is what I call the collectivist premise. And this is looking at the welfare of the group rather than the well-being of the individual. And says, what's good for, quote, society as a whole? How should we distribute society's resources in a fair way? I think the better way, the more rational way to think about political issues is to focus on the individual. And I think if you think about what's good for the individual, you come to a very different conclusion. So the two essentials, in my judgment, of what makes a happy and successful life, and I think this came through in all the talks today, is thought and effort. This is Isaac Newton and Steve Jobs. It's thought and effort. The willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to think about what's true, what's right, what's good, and then the effort to execute and carry out your plans. That's really what is going to make you happy, successful, and achieve the things you want to achieve in life. And therefore, if we're thinking about what a good political system is, it's one that encourages and protects your ability to exercise thought and effort and then to keep the results. This is my daughter, Olivia. She's about 1.5 now. More her. More her. I promise this will end at some point. Okay. So, just to illustrate this point that the welfare state is interfering with thought and effort, the core activities that we need in order to live a happy, successful life. When my wife was pregnant, we thought a lot about, well, how the heck are we going to raise this little creature into something useful? Like, what are we going to do? And, how are we going to encourage her to be independent? How are we going to encourage her to, to tackle life with all the vigor that it requires and so on? But it also occurred to me at a certain point, what if I were evil? What if instead of wanting to raise her to be a happy, independent adult, I wanted to crush her little infant spirits and just completely turn her into a wreck, a dependent of a human being? And I made a list. So I wouldn't teach her to make good decisions. I would just tell her what to do and demand that she obey me. I wouldn't make her work for anything. I'd just give her stuff, make her an entitled brat. Unless she was so evil as to go and try to get her own job and work for stuff, in which case, now she's going to get charged rent. I would tell her, hey, forget property rights, help yourself to other people's stuff, and don't object if they help themselves to yours. And then I would take out tons of loans in her name and go spend it on Vegas. So that would be pretty rotten. But that, in effect, is the whole essence of what the welfare state does. What the welfare state does is it stops and punishes us from doing the right things and rewards us for doing the wrong things. The more rational, productive, independent-minded we are, the worse we are under this scenario, and the more lazy, dependent, unambitious we are, the better we are. That's really the whole setup. And let me give you one example to really drive this home. So, my dad and I have very different goals for retirement. He's been running 2 tech companies for now over a decade, and he's looking forward to just a couple decades playing golf, traveling the world with mom. I want to be doing this, speaking and writing and so on, as long as I can. Now, given those different goals, we would have very different approaches to preparing for retirement, right? We'd save vastly different sums. We'd probably start saving at different times. We'd put it in different kinds of investments. We'd make a lot of different decisions. Yet the welfare state, even if it worked the way that we're told it should work, right? Even if it really was, the government was setting aside your money into a 401k or something so that when you retired, you had an earned benefit. Even then, it would interfere with you making those kinds of assessments. It would say, hey, Watkins, No, you got to save 12.4% today rather than use it on things like starting a family or starting a business or buying a home. No, you have to do what we say you have to do with it. That is the whole essence and the deeper meaning of the welfare state, is it interferes with our ability to make those independent judgments. And so I think if we think deeply about political issues, we need to think about the need for the freedom to make the assessments about how we plan our lives, including our old age.
We're taking a different look of something that we've been diving into in the last couple of years. Now, we have Don Watkins right here. How Social Security is sabotaging the land of self-reliance. Bring it on home. Good stuff, man.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, you got it.
By the way, if you can do the math, is longer than we've had Social Security since 1935. Now, did the elderly starve in the streets? And it turns out that amazingly, no. Amazingly, people figured out a way to live without handouts for over 100 years, and it's pretty fantastic when you think about it. They were very entrepreneurial in their whole approach to life. And so I'm just going to go through some of the mechanisms that they took in order to not, as they say, starve in the streets. So first of all, people worked. It's kind of funny today where we think of like, oh, work's a real burden. But actually, the people pushing for a welfare state complained for many years because the elderly, those darn people, refused to retire. The fact is that they found their lives more meaningful, more valuable, more enjoyable with work than without it. So the first reason, I think, is what I call the collectivist premise. And this is looking at the welfare of the group rather than the well-being of the individual. And says, what's good for, quote, society as a whole? How should we distribute society's resources in a fair way? I think the better way, the more rational way to think about political issues is to focus on the individual. And I think if you think about what's good for the individual, you come to a very different conclusion. So the two essentials, in my judgment, of what makes a happy and successful life, and I think this came through in all the talks today, is thought and effort. This is Isaac Newton and Steve Jobs.